Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talk Tech with Tiff. In this episode, I sat down with Maariyah, who is a chief of staff. She works currently as a chief of staff at a FinTech company, previously chief of staff at Uber. But tech wasn't always in her path. She actually started out in college studying neuroscience and then transitioned into chief of staff. We're going to cover how she made that leap and what it took. Also to really diving into imposter syndrome. I know I learned a lot and how to think of imposter syndrome in many different ways from this episode. Also, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to my monthly newsletter. I linked it down below. It's completely free and features some unique discount codes, job postings, and career advice. Okay, let's dive into it. Welcome to Talk Tech with Tiff, the New York edition, where I am sitting down with industry professionals to hear about their career journeys and current roles. I created this series to hear from people who are established in the tech industry so that we can all learn what these individuals do in their day-to-day jobs and the type of opportunities out there. Hi, Maariyah. How's it going?
Hi, Tiff. It's good. Welcome to New York.
I know. Thank you.
Happy to have you here.
I know. I am so happy to have connected with you in person because I feel like it's so strange, the internet. Like, I feel like on one hand, I know you for so long and whatnot, but then this is our first time meeting in person.
I know. We've known each other for like a year and a half, probably on Instagram.
I know.
But similarly, I'm like, I feel like I know everything about you, but then we just had a conversation about you're taller in person than I thought and like all of these things. And so it's great to see you.
I know. And by the time this airs, other personal things will have probably come out.
Yes. Yes.
It's very exciting though.
Yeah.
How are you? How's your
I'm
weekend
good.
going?
I'm good. It's beautiful weather in Brooklyn today, as you know. This is like the best season, the fall, when the leaves are changing, everyone has the energy, so it's good. And I'm excited to just chill this weekend, do some brunch.
Perfect. Yes, brunch is key.
Yeah.
I agree. So we did an Instagram live a long time ago, it feels like, but the conversation we had really stuck with me because your journey into your current role as chief of staff is so, to me, it's so inspiring.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a straightforward path, which I love. I love because I think it does such a great way of showing that, hey, you know, it's so important to pivot and to identify what you're passionate about and where your interest lies. So for those who are listening and don't know about your background and your journey, I'd love for you to share a little bit more about it.
Yeah, thanks for having me and letting me share my story. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Maariyah, born and raised in Southern California. So I'm from Orange County. I moved to New York about 5.5 years ago when I started my career. And I come from a family of, my mom's a doctor, and my dad works in computer science type stuff. But I was the first in my family to really go to school, like college in the United States. Both of my parents studied abroad, and I have two younger sisters. So I think a lot of where I get my inspiration for sharing my journey is giving advice to my younger self or my younger sisters, because when I was navigating it, I had no role models or people that I could look up to and say, what does a career in tech look like? I didn't even know tech existed as a field, right? For me, growing up in a brown immigrant family, it was you're either going to be a doctor, you're going to be a lawyer, or you're going to be an engineer. And there's no other career path available, right? Yeah, that's it. So for the longest time, I was pre-med. I actually studied neuroscience in university, which is nothing to do with my day-to-day. But it wasn't until I got to college where I realized the vast careers that exist that are outside those three fields. And I would have never been exposed to those had I not gone to university and, you know, had a good guidance counselor or had these things. But it's unfair that is what led me to this path. And I didn't have the resources that exist for others who maybe have parents or siblings or just a network outside of that. So my career journey starts, I guess, in college, really, where I was pre-med and just didn't enjoy that path. I think I enjoyed studying science because I've always been good at science, and neuroscience particularly is really interesting.
Cool.
It's super interesting, and it connects to business. Like when you think later down the line about decision making and purchase power, it's all related to science, right? But at the time I was like, I don't want to be in a lab. I don't really want to do the research. So I stumbled upon an internship at JP Morgan at the time, which was called, these programs still exist today. They're called Launching Leaders. And Winning Women. So they're initiatives that are put on by Wall Street to bring more women and diversity into the field. So I applied to this program that just said, free trip to New York. I didn't even know that it was an internship or anything like that. This is how naive I was. I mean, I was also 19 at the time. And I had no role models, right? So I was like, free trip to New York? I've never been to New York. Let's go, right? And at the time, my parents, for those of us who grow up in, immigrant households, travel isn't always like accessible and things like that. So my parents were like, okay, you can do it for school purposes, right? So I was like, okay, great. We got a free trip to New York. So I applied to this program and miraculously got in, even though I probably shouldn't have given the qualifications. But I got in because I think my interviewer was just like, I see something in you. Excited to, whatever. So they gave me a chance there. And the program was really interesting. It was actually an interview process that happened to be disguised as a summit. Maybe someone who knows the industry better would know that it was an interview, but I didn't because I thought it was just a summit in New York for women in tech or women in finance at the time. So the 2 weeks leading up to that, my interviewer was like, by the way, you have a super day to get an interview. And I didn't even know what a super day is. But now we do, right? It's a 4-step interview process. So for 2 weeks, I was a neuroscience major. I didn't even know what an accounting statement was. I just crash coursed everything about. I had 2 weeks between getting the interview and then the interview to learn everything I need to know about finance. So I just did a self-crash course. And these are resources I still share to this day. There's a resource called 100 Questions to Get into Investment Banking. They're all free resources. YouTube is amazing if you just search discounted cash flow or whatever. That's what I did. For 2 weeks, I just crash coursed. I learned everything I needed to know about finance, or at least enough to get through the interviews, right? And then I got the internship. And so that was really what started my career. So I did about 1.5 years on Wall Street as a full-time analyst, but I also did 2 internships. So I interned at JP Morgan twice, once in equity capital markets and once in healthcare banking, and decided to come back full-time in healthcare banking. So I was a healthcare investment banker for about 1.5 years. And then I moved to tech 4 years ago. Well, 5 years ago now, but 4 years ago at the time, and did 4 years at Uber, which you know. And I recently, about a few months ago, moved over to a FinTech company. And so that's a shortened version of the career journey. But really what I want to say is I think sometimes we can have a set perspective of what our journey can look like. And oftentimes we set that very early on, right? At 19 years old. And now that I'm almost 27, it's like, I didn't know what existed back then, right? And so I guess if I look back on the journey, I would just say, have a vision of your life, but also don't have it be so rigid that it prevents you from exploring what comes along the way.
I love that. It's funny. I know, you're saying this to people who are just starting out, but honestly, I needed to hear that right now because I think sometimes even as you grow in your career, maybe it's just certain personalities, and I'm one of them, I have moments where, and Paul, my partner, can attest to this, where it's like, late at night, I wake him up and I'm like, where am I going to be in the next 5 years? What's going to happen? Is this, you know what I mean? In all of this fear. So having that kind of, vision or plan, but also being open because you really don't know how it will translate. Okay, wait, going back a second here. When that interview and internship occurred, were you done? Did you have to go back to college afterwards So did you finish then neuroscience or did you switch?
So this was my sophomore year of university for those international. That's your second year out of 4. And typically, even today in the American university process, your main internship is the summer between your junior and senior year. So the year before you graduate. But I encourage all of you, if you can get an internship the summer between your sophomore and junior year, that's great because then you can set up for next year. So this was that time period. So essentially, this was October, around this time of my sophomore year where I applied to the internship. And I got it for that summer and then did the summer internship, got a return offer to come back to the company for the next summer.
So smart.
Yeah. So then went back to school and, did my junior year and then went back to JP Morgan, but in a different group because I wanted to explore. And then at the end of that summer, I got a return offer, a full-time return offer. So by August, before my senior year, I actually had a job offer lined up for next year. Now, I know the environment today, like I actually wouldn't recommend that today because of if you're working in tech. Finance is more set. But if you're working in tech, I mean, you've seen all the layoffs recently, the rescinds, the offer. So I actually, I tell my sister this who just interned in tech over the summer. She's at university. She's much younger than me. And so I told her, even if you get a return offer, continue to network because you never know right now in tech when things are, unfortunately getting pulled.
It's so true.
But back to your question, I ended up, I graduated with a neuroscience degree. So I have a neuroscience degree that I never use, but I actually decided to double major in business. So what I did was for me, the actual science was interesting. The classes I was taking, like I mentioned, decision making, thinking about neural pathways, all of that's really interesting to me just as a curiosity point, not really from a tactical perspective. But I was already a business minor, even my first year, because I thought I was going to open a clinic, or I thought I wanted to be, as I said, a doctor. And I said, if I'm going to be a doctor, I could work in a clinic. Business is helpful, right? And so when I was taking my business classes, I think business majors get a bit of a bad rep sometimes because people think it's an easy major. It's a little bit of a, an easy time. But I do think that if you have the ability to study business, the practical skills that you gain, I took a class on resume writing. I took a class on interviews. I took a class on communication. These are skills that I use to this day, and
are so transferable to any industry.
They're so transferable. I like the combination of my majors because I felt like my neuroscience major taught me to think deeply about the world and think more philosophically, whereas my business major was very tactical. Like I learned skills that were very much like Excel. But again, I didn't do those until my junior and senior year. So by that time, I already had my internship. So the other thing is, if it does not matter what you study in university. Because in tech today, I know people who are philosophy majors, neuroscience majors, communications majors that do anything. And I know your path, you studied fashion and then you worked in, tech and coding, right? So I think it's really up there. You can do whatever you want. And for me, that combination was just interesting as I went through my degree.
And it's so true. And I always say too, even though after college or university, you didn't necessarily pursue a career with neuroscience, I'm sure a lot of, you mentioned it showed you the world, or you got to think of the world in a more scientific way or a different, and even though it might not directly apply to your role right now, I'm sure there are so many things that just translate in different ways,
Definitely. I think it just, I think different thought processes help you learn in different ways. And you also meet a wider group of people, right? And so now to this day, I think, I work in the business side of tech, as we'll talk about, but I interact with engineers all the time. I interact with product all the time. And a lot of those folks come from science backgrounds, right? And so understanding how maybe I think versus others think, that comes from a background of studying different things and just being open to different thought processes.
And that's such an important skill, understanding how others think, that a lot of people maybe aren't so good at. So I think it's really, really awesome. So let's get into the business side and talk a little bit about the role of chief of staff.
Great.
I guess maybe let's start with, and I'm kind of going a little off script here, but for those chief of staff, when I think of chief of staff, I'm like, that is a massive title. I'm like, whoa, so what does it entail? And maybe every company is a bit different, but for someone who isn't as familiar with the role or curious about it.
Yeah, so chief of staff is, I would say, a relatively new-ish role in popularity in tech. I would say it's come to the industry maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and it actually has its background in politics, which is interesting. Like the role of chief of staff was like presidents would have chief of staffs as advisors.
Yes.
So they were separate to their day-to-day staff, and their function in politics was to be a third-party advisor to someone in power, right?
Yeah.
And so tech now, 5-6 years ago, adopted this role because they realized that if you think about an executive, let's say a CEO of your
Yes.
company or a CFO or something like that, they typically have a bunch of people that report to them, right? They could have hundreds, thousands of people that report to them, and they all have different functions.
Yes.
And they all have maybe interests that are within their own teams, right? They're not unbiased in their incentives. So the idea of a chief of staff is you are reporting to your executive,
Yeah.
but you don't have a specific scope within that team so that you can be somewhat of an unbiased third party. And so realistically, when I think about the chief of staff role, it's so different based on who you support. Some chief of staffs are highly analytical. Some chief of staffs are highly focused on communication
Yeah.
and org management. And so it really, sometimes executives look for a chief of staff that's like their clone, right? Like they're an extension of them. They're a second person.
Yeah.
And sometimes sometimes executives look for chief of staffs who are their exact complement. So maybe they're great analytically, but they're not good with communication. So they hire a
Yes.
chief of staff who's really good with communication, can
Ah.
round out their skills. This is my second chief of staff role,
Yeah.
which we'll talk about. I did a chief of staff role at Uber,
Mhm.
and now I'm doing a chief of staff role at this FinTech company, and they're so different. You know, my last chief of staff role, I would say that I was that complement
Yeah.
here, where I served as a counter to
Yeah.
my principal.
I see. Yeah.
And now I would say I'm more of an extension. And so it's interesting to have both of those backgrounds. But if I were
Yes.
to boil down what does a chief of staff do, because on my Instagram, that's the number one question I get. It's
Oh,
like,
I bet.
what is a chief of
Yes.
staff?
Yeah.
What do you do? How do you
Yeah.
become a chief of staff?
Yes.
I would say it's 3 different job functions.
Okay.
And I would say I spend 30% of my time in each of them. So on a
Oh.
given week, maybe 1 week, it's all on one area, but then over time, it evens out.
Yes.
So I would say the first bucket is project and program management.
Okay.
So if you support an executive, I will oversee a lot of our day-to-day core processes,
Yeah.
like our, executive QBRs,
Okay.
executive reviews. I oversee all of our offsites, action items, just really making sure that the business is moving forward,
Yeah.
and making sure that my executive is set up for success.
Yes.
And the second bucket is really strategic projects.
Okay.
So say you're in the org and a project is across the business. There's no natural owner.
Yeah.
That's where I would come in. So I maybe parachute in for 2 to 3 months, clean up a certain thing, and then move on.
Yes.
So it's somewhat similar to consulting in
That's
that
what I was
sense.
thinking. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
internal.
Yes. Yeah.
And then you report directly to your executive so you can clean things up, move them quickly, and move them faster.
Yeah.
And I actually did a corporate strategy role previously, so that's most similar to this part of
Okay.
the job.
Yeah.
And then the last bucket I would say is like people management and the people side of things.
Yes.
So I manage my executive assistant. I also oversee a lot of our people initiatives. So sitting on our women's board and planning certain events, focusing on diversity, focusing on hiring, focusing on interviews. So really the people side of things
Yes.
is the last bucket
Yeah.
of the role. And so it varies. Like one day I could be deep in a model doing some kind of financial analysis. And the next day I could be thinking about our growth strategy. And then the next day I could be thinking about hiring people, right? And so
Wow.
that's what I really like about this role.
Yes.
I think it's very varied and it's very different.
Yes.
But I don't think it's for everyone for
Yeah.
that reason also.
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of on that note, and I want to get to that last point. It's not for everyone as well, but going back to, okay, first of all, that role is intense in the best way possible. But if you're someone who adapts to and thrives in that environment of working in wearing multiple hats and really cross-functional with so many different teams and people, and the role itself is as big as the title.
Not always. I think what's interesting is people don't realize that it's one of those roles where you will always be the most junior person in the room by design.
Ah.
So the reason for that is I think the perfect time to be a chief of staff, if anyone's interested in the role, is about like 5 to 10 years into your career.
Okay.
So let's say that, you're not so junior, like you're not right out of school, you're not an analyst, you're not right there.
Yes.
Because if you're too junior, you don't have the executive presence and influence to actually do the job. But if you're too senior, let's say you're 15 plus years, you're 20 years, you're too senior to do the nitty-gritty parts of the job, because in my role, I draft all of my executives' communications.
Yes.
I manage all of our action items. I manage our trackers. That's not something that, say, like a VP, SVP wants to do, right? Or is used to doing for many years. So I think that sweet spot is like 5 to 10 years into your career, when you're kind of like a manager, senior manager. You've had some kind of experience with management. You've had some kind of experience with analytics, but you're also not, used to overseeing hundreds of teams, because it's an independent contributor role.
Yes.
In tech, we have individual contributor roles, which are IC roles, and then you have manager roles.
Yes.
And I've done both. I was a manager, and in this role, I'm mostly an IC. I oversee just one person. And so that's different than, say, overseeing a team of like 10, 15.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think it's really that sweet spot of doing it right there. I think I view it personally as my own executive MBA. So I never went to business school.
Yes.
And that's a separate topic. We don't need to go into that. I have a lot of reasons for that. But I view my chief of staff gig, because often it's a 2 to 3 year job.
Yes.
Like there's somewhat of an understanding that says you're going to do this role for 2 to 3 years. Then you'll move on and go back into the business, be a manager, do something like that. So I view it as my equivalent of a paid MBA, because you take a step back, you reevaluate what you want to do. And in every strategic project I do, I think, do I want to work in marketing, for example, if I'm doing a marketing project? Do I want to work in communications? Do I want to work in finance? And so that's a little bit of the benefits of the role. So in the sense of, it is a lot of responsibility. You're often I often encounter imposter syndrome in the sense of being the most junior person in the room. Because it's very easy to say, why am I here? I only have, 5, 6 years of experience, but folks here have 20. Why am I here? So it is in that sense challenging. But on the flip side, you're in rooms that you would never be in if you weren't in this role.
Exactly.
Right? So major pros to the role, I would say, but also not cons, but it's not an easy one.
Yes.
In that sense.
Yes, exactly. Okay, I'm gonna look at our questions here, or else I'm gonna ask you so many questions that are totally continuing to go on, because I feel like, I have so much. Well, you know what? We're doing good.
We're good. We're good. We're on script.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, you know what? Then on that note, and I'm kind of going again off script, but you mentioned, oftentimes being the most junior person in the room, and you're sitting there with a bunch of executives. Just even sharing that is, for a lot of people, it's like, whoa, that's intense. So how do you kind of overcome, or I don't know if overcome's the right word, but how do you navigate those feelings of like, should I be here or not? Do you know what I mean though? Like, how do you navigate? Yeah.
I think that is a constant battle. I think that, one of the things that we talk about, especially as women in tech and, women from underrepresented backgrounds in tech particularly, I don't think that feeling goes away. I've read many articles that have tried to say, like, here's how you overcome imposter syndrome, or here's how to get rid of it. And I think more so what I recommend is, how do you live with it in a manageable way?
I love that.
Because every step of the way, I faced imposter syndrome when I was working in investment banking. And at that time, no one looked like me. And, I didn't see any brown women in investment banking, let alone brown women who like to do their hair and like to do their makeup and wore, pink blazers to work. Like, I didn't see any of that. Right. And that was a different kind of imposter syndrome. That was just, why am I here? Not, can I do the job? Because I had done internships. 2 internships, and I was like, I can do the job, but more just, I don't feel like I belong here. Then I moved to tech, and then I felt a certain slew of imposter syndrome that wasn't, I saw people who looked like me, but I just didn't feel like I had the qualifications for the job. That's when I felt, and I think we talked about this when I first applied to Uber, the role that I applied to asked for 4 to 6 years of experience. and I only had 1.5 at the time. And I still applied for the job. We could talk about that separately, and got the job. But then when I was in the role, I was like, the imposter syndrome that hit was a competency related imposter syndrome.
Yes.
I was like, I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
People would say acronyms all the time. They were like, oh, can you use SQL to figure this out? And or SQL to figure this out.
Yeah.
I didn't know what that was.
You're like Googling, you're like, what
I was like, what is that? And then I look it up, and it's like a somewhat coding language. And I was like, this is
too much.
This is not, I don't know how to do this, right?
Yeah.
I didn't know how to use SQL.
Yeah.
But that was a different kind of imposter syndrome than the lack of belonging. And then now it's an imposter syndrome of not competency and not belonging, but more so, why me? Like, why am I in this role?
Yeah.
Why did I get this opportunity and not someone else who maybe is more qualified than me?
Yes.
And so each of these imposter syndromes have been different and different to navigate. And so my advice would be, first, recognize that you're going to have imposter syndrome at every stage in your life.
Yeah.
And just learn to be comfortable with it.
Yeah.
Learn to manage it. The second would be identify the type of imposter syndrome. They're not all the same.
Yeah.
Is it due to belonging? Is it due to competency?
Never thought of it like that.
Is it due to, why me?
Yes.
Because these are different and you manage them differently. So once you figure that out, then I would try to overcome it. So in my current role as why me, often I just think about, well, I went through 6 rounds of interviews for this process. If it wasn't supposed to be me, one of those rounds would have failed.
Exactly.
Right? Like, think about how intense tech interviews are. And for chief of staff roles, they're intense, but they're also very sometimes subjective, right? Like, the most important part of the role is, will you work well with your executive?
Yes.
So it's somewhat of a vibe check at the end, right? And so I would think, okay, if this wasn't supposed to be me, somewhere in the 6 interviews, something would have messed up.
Exactly.
So that I think back to, and I'm like, okay, they saw something in me. Let me see it for myself.
Yes.
And then in the competency related one, if you're facing that, I would say just break down what you need to learn into smaller things.
Yeah.
So when I didn't know how to use SQL, I just took it step by step, where I was like, what is SQL?
Yeah.
First of all,
Start with
what is it? Okay, it's somewhat of a coding language.
Yeah.
Okay, what are the basic functions?
Yes.
What is minimum competency, minimum viable product look like? Like, just step by step.
Yeah.
And then you can get there. And if it's in the belonging piece, I mean, that we talk about a lot on Instagram, like, find your community, right?
Yeah.
If you feel like you are the only one in a role, see if you can join an employee resource group.
Yes. Yeah.
Come to us on our
exactly.
platforms.
Yeah.
We'll connect you. That one, I think, is a little bit more manageable.
Yes, I agree. Wow. This conversation couldn't have come at a better time, because literally the way you broke it down, the different kinds of imposter syndrome, really, I can totally relate to it. And I feel like I'm going through something similar right now with the why me one. But I have gone through all of the other ones that you listed.
Yeah.
And just to hear that others go through it.
Right.
But when you hear it, there's something about
Feels
like,
different.
Yeah, okay, I'm not alone in this. And so thank you for being so candid about it. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. I think it's important to talk about, because we can often see, whether in work or social media, everyone has their stuff together.
Yeah.
But in reality, you're only sharing that top 10%, right? You're sharing the tip of the iceberg, as they say, and you're managing through certain things in the background.
Exactly.
And so I think talking about it makes it a little bit more attainable.
It does. And it's hard. It's one thing I struggle with is, going back to sharing it on social media and what you share on social media. It's hard because, or for me anyways, I want to share more of the things I go through.
Right.
But I'm also like, people at my company follow me.
Yeah.
So it's that weird, and which, being open and honest is something they would embrace and love, of course. But it's finding that balance of, I don't want to appear to have it all together, but at the same time, I don't want, you know what I mean? Like,
you don't want it to be like, used against you in a way, or things like that. That's one of the things. I don't share my age on social media.
Yeah.
And part of the reason I don't do that is for that reason. Because I don't want to I don't want people to think, oh, she's younger than I thought,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Or
Based on your role,
based on my
based on your
role,
experience.
or
Yeah.
based on experience, or like, why would I listen to her? She
Yeah.
barely has X amount of years of
Yeah.
experience. And so I think that's very much the key. And I think people, when you share your experiences, some people appreciate it,
Yeah.
but some people will double down on the why her element,
Yes.
you know? So we're talking
Yeah.
about why me, but then they might be thinking, why her?
her?
You know, I
Yeah.
have 10 years of experience.
Exactly.
I have, 8 years,
Yeah.
or, I went to this school, which is
Mhm.
better than her school, or
Mhm.
whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so sometimes you self-sabotage because
Yeah.
you're like, what gives me the authority to
Yeah.
speak on this topic? But I think typically what I think about is I'm not an authority figure. I'm
Mhm.
just here sharing my experiences.
Exactly. Your journey.
Right?
Yes.
This is my journey. This might not work for you. This
Mhm.
is not advice here, but this
Yeah.
worked for me.
Yes.
So maybe it helps,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I love
And so just reframing it as you're not an advisor, but you're more so a storyteller.
Yes,
in that
exactly.
sense.
Exactly. I feel like I could sit here and pick your brain forever. And this is why I said to you, I literally am planning to come back to New York and
Yes.
just have like a weekend of just like full, like
Yes, let's
just
do
like
it.
connecting over coffee and whatnot.
Yes.
But to kind of wrap up our conversation, something that I always ask everyone and is really around what advice would, and you shared so much amazing advice that I'm just like, I could just listen and listen to this. But what advice would you give to your younger self?
That's interesting. I think I would tell my younger self on the very beginning, I would just tell her to relax.
Yeah.
Like things will work out.
Mhm.
I think I was very, very high strung as in high school and in early college. I think some of that comes with just being the oldest child,
Yeah.
and sometimes the oldest child of an immigrant family.
Yeah.
It was very much
Even more so.
even more so. That pressure was on because there
Yes.
was a pressure of figuring things out, but also doing things in the right way and balancing your identity with your ambitions, which I still navigate.
Yeah.
As you know, personally, I got married young. I got married at 23.
Mhm.
And that's not like my coworkers in investment banking were like, what is going, things like that. And so balancing like a lot of those elements of maybe more of my traditional identity, but also my ambitions. I think I had a lot of stress around that growing up. And so first of all, I would tell my younger self to just have faith. It'll work out. And it might not work out in the first go around, but every misstep, every rejection is really just redirection.
Yeah.
Because I remember, we don't talk a lot about this, but I didn't want to move to New York. I wanted to stay in California.
I was going to ask you.
Yeah, I didn't. I ended up here somewhat accidentally.
Yeah.
I'm from California. I had no intention 5 years ago to move to New York.
Yeah.
And actually at the time, my parents were really against the idea because in our community, women don't really move out of their homes until they get married.
Yeah.
And I left home unmarried and moved across the country. Very unheard of.
Especially as the oldest daughter.
As the oldest daughter in the community, in our Muslim community, wasn't a thing.
Yeah.
But I did that because this job was the one that came, right? I tried to get a job in San Francisco, and I got rejected at the very last round. And it was a consulting job, actually, at McKinsey.
Yeah.
And so that would have been a very different career path.
Yeah.
And I would have been a management consultant instead of a banker. But it didn't work out. In the very last round, it didn't work out.
Wow.
And so I was basically, well, I'm going to New York. And it wasn't from a lack of trying, right? And so I think, and then I moved to New York and I met my now husband here in New York. He's from New York. And so obviously there was that rejection that I talked about was redirection. Like I was meant to be in this city for that reason. And I love the city now and things like that. And my career would not have been the same if I had stayed in California.
Yeah.
So, and neither would be my personal life. So I think that the first thing I tell myself is just to relax and take things step by step.
Yeah.
Like don't overplan the future, which we talked about at the beginning.
Yeah.
And then the second thing I would tell myself is you have more ability than you give yourself credit for. I think a lot of us are our own worst critics. Like we tend to not see our potential the most sometimes, or at least I do.
Yeah, I
I think we're our own harshest critics, right? And as cheesy as it sounds, sometimes people will come to me, my friends will come to me and tell me about a problem, and I will hype them up to the extent, right? I'm like, Tiff, you got this.
Yeah.
You are so you're so competent. Don't worry about it. You got this. But then I speak to myself in not that way. I'm always like, girl, you're gonna struggle. Like, you don't have it. You're not it, right? And I think why am I so compassionate towards my friends and my family, and to myself I'm so critical, and I'm so sometimes unappreciative. And so I think I would just tell myself to be kinder and realize that the ability is there, and sometimes you are your own worst critic.
I love that. Be kinder to yourself. Speak to yourself the way you speak to others.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To your best friend. Like, speak to yourself like you would to your best friend, your partner, whatever.
Yeah.
Because you would never tell them you suck. And sometimes you tell yourself you suck, right? And so that's what I would say.
That is great. I love that. That's such a great way, such a positive note to end this conversation. Thank you so much for your time and all your wisdom. I'm like soaking it up. It was so great to
Thanks for having me, Tiff. Thanks for watching, everyone. And I hope you come back soon.
I will, for sure. And for anyone who wants to learn more about Maariyah and her journey, I'll link down below your socials and anything else.
That'd be great. Would love to have you join the community. Tiff is doing amazing things on YouTube and Instagram. And we have a really great community of women in tech there, which is how we connected.
I know.
So hope you all come our way.
Exactly. Thanks, everyone.